Sarah Martinez had dreamed of flying since she was 7 years old. Growing up in the small town of Cedar Falls, Texas, she would lie on her back in the dusty fields behind her grandmother's house, watching military jets streak across the endless blue sky. Her heart would race with each distant roar of engines, and she would close her eyes and imagine herself at the controls, soaring through clouds with nothing but sky ahead. At 23, Sarah stood exactly 5 feet 2 inches tall in her combat boots. She had earned her college degree in aerospace engineering with highest honors. She could take apart and rebuild any aircraft engine blindfolded. She had logged more flight simulator hours than most veteran pilots. But according to the United States Air Force, she was 2 inches too short to qualify for pilot training. The rejection letter arrived on a Tuesday morning at Randolph Air Force Base, where Sarah worked as an aircraft maintenance specialist. She read it 3 times before the words sank in. Height requirements for pilot candidates, minimum 5 feet 4 inches. The same requirement that had crushed her dreams 2 years ago when she first applied. Staff Sergeant Mike peered over her shoulder as she folded the letter. "Still trying to play with the big boys, Martinez," he said with a smirk. "Maybe it's time to accept that some people are just built for different jobs." Sarah kept her face neutral, but her hands trembled slightly as she tucked the letter into her pocket. She had worked twice as hard as anyone else on the base to prove herself. While other mechanics called it quits at 5 o'clock, Sarah stayed late, studying flight manuals and working on aircraft until her fingers were black with grease and her back ached from hunching over engines. "The height requirement exists for a reason," continued, warming to his favorite topic. "You need to reach all the controls properly. It's about safety, not feelings." "I can reach every control in every aircraft we maintain," Sarah replied quietly. "I've been inside the cockpit of every fighter jet on this base." Laughed. "Reaching controls in a hangar is different from flying at 30,000 feet when your life depends on it. Face facts, Martinez. You're too small for this job." Other mechanics had gathered around now, some nodding in agreement. Sarah had heard these comments before, but today they cut deeper. Today, her dream had officially died for the second time. That evening, Sarah drove her old pickup truck to the edge of town, where the wheat field stretched toward the horizon. She parked near the fence line and climbed into the truck bed, just like she used to do as a child. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded her why she had fallen in love with flying in the first place. Her phone buzzed with a text from her younger brother, Danny, who was serving overseas with the Army. "Any word on the pilot program?" he had written. Sarah stared at the message for a long time before typing back. "Didn't work out this time." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, Danny's response came through. "They're lost, sis. You're the best pilot I know, even if you've never actually flown." Sarah smiled despite herself. Danny had always believed in her, even when she couldn't believe in herself. He was the one who had encouraged her to join the Air Force in the first place, even if it meant starting as a mechanic instead of a pilot. The next morning brought news that would change everything, though Sarah didn't know it yet. A massive hurricane was forming in the Gulf of Mexico, unlike anything meteorologists had seen before. Hurricane was projected to make landfall as a Category 5 storm, with winds exceeding 180 miles per hour. The storm's path would take it directly over several major cities along the Texas coast. At the morning briefing, Colonel James addressed the entire maintenance crew. "Ladies and we're facing an unprecedented situation. Hurricane is projected to be the strongest storm to hit the Gulf Coast in recorded history. We've been tasked with evacuating critical personnel and equipment from 3 coastal air bases before the storm makes landfall." Sarah listened carefully as Colonel outlined the evacuation plan. Aircraft would need to be flown inland to safety, along with essential personnel and equipment. It was a massive logistical operation that would require every pilot and aircraft on the base. "The problem," continued the colonel, is that we're short on pilots. Several of our most experienced aviators are overseas and others are on medical leave. We'll be stretched thin." After the briefing, Sarah approached her immediate supervisor, Technical Sergeant Williams. "Sarge, I'd like to volunteer for any additional duties during the evacuation. I know these aircraft better than anyone." Williams nodded. "Appreciate the offer, Martinez. We'll need all the help we can get with pre-flight inspections and loading operations." As Sarah walked back to her workstation, she couldn't shake the feeling that this storm was going to test everyone on the base in ways they couldn't imagine. She had no idea that within 48 hours, those 2 inches that had kept her from pilot training would be the least of anyone's concerns. That afternoon, as she performed routine maintenance on an F-16 Fighting Falcon, Sarah allowed herself one last dream. She imagined herself at the controls, not for glory or personal achievement, but to save lives when no one else could. She had no way of knowing that this exact scenario was about to become reality. Hurricane continued to intensify as it churned through the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. By Wednesday evening, meteorologists were calling it a once-in-a-lifetime storm, with the potential to cause catastrophic damage across hundreds of miles of coastline. The National Weather Service had issued evacuation orders for over 2 million people. At Randolph Air Force Base, the pace of preparation had become frantic. Aircraft were being fueled and prepped for immediate departure to inland bases. Personnel worked around the clock to secure equipment and transfer critical files and supplies. Sarah found herself assigned to a special team responsible for preparing the base's most valuable aircraft for evacuation. These weren't just any planes. They included experimental fighters worth hundreds of millions of dollars, reconnaissance aircraft filled with classified technology, and medical transport planes that would be desperately needed after the storm passed. "Martinez, I need you to perform final inspections on the X-47 prototypes," called Technical Sergeant Williams over the noise of jet engines. "These birds need to be perfect before they fly." The X-47 was an experimental unmanned combat aircraft that Sarah had worked on extensively. She knew every bolt, wire, and circuit in its revolutionary design. As she climbed up to inspect the aircraft's systems, she noticed several of the pilots gathered nearby, looking worried. "I don't like it," she heard Captain Rick Torres saying to Major Lisa. "The weather window is getting narrower by the hour. We've got 12 aircraft that need to be moved and only 8 qualified pilots available." "What about bringing in pilots from other bases?" asked Major. "They're all dealing with their own evacuation procedures," replied Torres. "We're on our own." Sarah pretended to focus on her inspection checklist, but she was listening to every word. She had studied the flight characteristics of every aircraft they needed to move. She knew their systems, their limitations, and their capabilities better than most of the pilots who would be flying them. Staff Sergeant appeared beside the aircraft. "Still think you could fly one of these, Martinez?" he said with his usual mocking tone. "I know I could," Sarah replied without looking up from her work. Laughed, "Right, and I could perform brain surgery. Just because you can fix something doesn't mean you can operate it." "Actually," said a voice from below, "she probably could." Sarah looked down to see Captain, one of the few female pilots on the base. Had a reputation as one of the best pilots in the squadron, and she had always treated Sarah with respect. "I've watched Martinez work," continued. "She understands these aircraft better than anyone. I've seen her spot problems that experienced pilots missed." Scoffed. "Understanding and flying are 2 different things. Besides, she doesn't meet the physical requirements." "Those requirements were written decades ago," said. "Modern aircraft are designed differently. Reach isn't the issue it used to be." Sarah felt a flush of gratitude toward Captain, but she also knew the conversation was pointless. Regulations were regulations, and no emergency was going to change decades of military protocol. That evening, the situation took a turn for the worse. Weather reports showed that hurricane had strengthened beyond all predictions. The storm was now packing winds of nearly 200 miles per hour, with a pressure reading that broke all previous records. Even more concerning, the storm had begun to move faster than expected. "We've moved up the evacuation timeline," announced Colonel at an emergency briefing. "All aircraft need to be airborne by 600 hours tomorrow morning. After that, the weather conditions will be too dangerous for takeoff." Sarah saw the worry in the faces around her. 12 aircraft, 8 pilots, and now less time than originally planned. The math was simple and frightening. "Sir," said Captain Torres, "with respect, we don't have enough pilots to move all the aircraft in the available window." Colonel's jaw tightened. "Then we'll have to prioritize. The experimental aircraft and medical transports are the highest priority. We may have to leave some of the older fighters behind." Sarah felt her heart sink. Those older fighters represented millions of dollars in equipment and technology. More importantly, they would be desperately needed for search and rescue operations after the storm passed. After the briefing, Sarah found herself walking alone across the flight line. The wind was already picking up, and dark clouds were visible on the southern horizon. She stopped beside one of the F-16s that might be left behind, running her hand along its sleek fuselage. "Terrible waste," said a voice behind her. Sarah turned to see Master Sergeant, the most senior enlisted person in the maintenance division. Had 30 years of experience and was respected by everyone on the base. "Yes, it is," Sarah agreed. Studied her for a moment. "You know, I've been watching you work for 2 years. I've never seen anyone with a better understanding of these machines." "Thank you, Sergeant. I also know about your pilot applications, about the height requirement." Paused. "You want to know what I think about that requirement?" Sarah nodded. "I think it's outdated bureaucratic nonsense. These modern aircraft are designed to accommodate a wide range of body types. The real requirements for flying are up here." He tapped his temple. "And in here," he placed his hand over his heart. Sarah felt tears threatening to form. "It doesn't matter what we think. The regulations are clear." "Regulations can change," said. "Sometimes circumstances force changes that should have happened years ago." As Sarah walked back to her quarters that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that Sergeant was trying to tell her something important. She had no way of knowing that by morning, circumstances would indeed force changes that no one could have predicted. The storm was coming, and with it, a test that would prove once and for all whether 2 inches of height mattered more than skill, knowledge, and courage. Thursday morning arrived with an ominous yellow-green sky and wind gusts that rattled the windows of every building on the base. Hurricane was now less than 12 hours from landfall, and the outer bands of the storm were already affecting weather conditions across South Texas. Sarah arrived at the flight line before dawn to find controlled chaos. Ground crews were rushing to complete final preparations on the aircraft scheduled for evacuation. Pilots were conducting hurried pre-flight briefings, their faces grim with concentration and worry. The plan was simple in theory. 8 pilots would take off in the first wave, flying the most critical aircraft to safety at inland bases. They would then return in transport aircraft to collect the remaining personnel and equipment. The second wave of aircraft would be handled by the same pilots on their return trip. Sarah watched as Captain climbed into the cockpit of one of the X-47 prototypes. Captain Torres was preparing an F-22 Raptor for departure. One by one, the pilots were taking their positions in the aircraft that would soon be racing against time and weather. At 5:30 hours, the first aircraft began taxiing toward the runway. Sarah stood with the other ground crew members, watching as millions of dollars worth of military hardware prepared to escape the approaching storm. The wind was getting stronger, making the aircraft rock slightly as they moved. Captain's X-47 was third in line for takeoff. Sarah watched as the experimental aircraft accelerated down the runway, its unique shape cutting through the increasingly turbulent air. One by one, the first 4 aircraft disappeared into the stormy sky. Then everything went wrong. Captain Tor's F-22 had just lifted off when the radio crackled with an emergency transmission. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Falcon 1. I'm experiencing complete hydraulic failure, attempting emergency landing." Sarah felt her blood turn cold. Hydraulic failure in an F-22 was a catastrophic emergency. Without hydraulic systems, the pilot had virtually no control over the aircraft's flight surfaces. "All aircraft, clear the airspace immediately," came the voice of the air traffic controller. "We have an emergency landing in progress." The remaining 4 aircraft that hadn't yet taken off were ordered to hold their positions. Captain Torres fought to control his damaged aircraft, but the F-22 was barely responding. Sarah watched in horror as the fighter jet approached the runway at an impossible angle, too fast and too steep. The crash was spectacular and terrifying. Torres managed to eject at the last second, his parachute barely opening before he hit the ground. The F-22 slammed into the runway with a tremendous explosion, sending debris flying across the flight line and creating a massive crater that blocked the main runway. "Is Torres okay?" someone shouted. "Rescue crews are on the way," came the reply, "but the runway is completely blocked. No aircraft can take off or land." Sarah felt the full weight of the disaster settling over the base. Captain Torres was alive but injured. The main runway was destroyed. And most critically, 4 extremely valuable aircraft were now trapped on the ground with a Category 5 hurricane bearing down on them. Colonel's voice came over the base-wide communication system. "All personnel not involved in rescue operations are to proceed immediately to the hardened shelters. Hurricane is now 6 hours from landfall. I repeat, all non-essential personnel to the shelters immediately." Sarah looked at the 4 aircraft sitting helplessly on the taxiway. 2 F-16 Fighting Falcons, 1 A-10 Thunderbolt, and most critically, a specialized medical transport aircraft that would be desperately needed for post-storm rescue operations. Together, they represented over $150 million in equipment and technology that the Air Force couldn't afford to lose. More importantly, Sarah knew that the medical transport plane could save hundreds of lives in the aftermath of the hurricane. It was equipped with advanced life support systems and could reach areas that ground vehicles couldn't access. Losing it would mean that people would die who might otherwise be saved. "There has to be another way," Sarah said to Master Sergeant, who had appeared beside her. "The auxiliary runway," said quietly. "It's shorter and hasn't been used for fighter aircraft in years, but it's structurally sound." Sarah's mind raced. The auxiliary runway was indeed shorter, too short for a normal takeoff with full fuel loads. But if the aircraft were stripped down to minimum fuel and essential systems only, the pilots would need to be extremely skilled, she continued's line of thinking, and they'd need to know every detail of the aircraft's performance characteristics. "The problem is," said, "we don't have any pilots left. The ones who made it out can't get back until after the storm passes, and even if they couldn't land on the auxiliary runway with the crosswinds that are already developing." Sarah stared at the trapped aircraft. She knew their systems better than anyone. She had studied their flight characteristics for years. She had logged hundreds of hours in flight simulators, preparing for pilot training that she would never be allowed to complete. "Sergeant," she said slowly, "what if someone else flew them out?" Looked at her for a long moment. "Martinez, you know that's impossible. Regulations." "Regulations that might cost lives and destroy millions of dollars in equipment," Sarah interrupted. "Regulations written by people who never imagined a situation like this." The wind was getting stronger, and they could see the first heavy raindrops beginning to fall. In a few hours, these aircraft would be sitting in the path of the most powerful hurricane ever recorded. They would be destroyed, and with them, any chance of using them for rescue operations when the storm passed. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. "Sergeant, I need you to help me with something. Something that might save those aircraft and the lives they could protect." Looked at her for a long moment, understanding exactly what she was suggesting. "Martinez, what you're talking about. It could end both our careers. And if we do nothing, people will die who don't have to die." The master sergeant was quiet for nearly a minute, looking at the aircraft, then at the approaching storm, then at Sarah's determined face. Finally, he nodded. "What do you need me to do?" Within an hour, the situation had become even more desperate. Hurricane had intensified further and was now moving faster than predicted. The storm was expected to make landfall in just 4 hours, not 6 as originally forecasted. The winds on the base were already gusting to over 60 miles per hour, making any flight operations extremely dangerous. Sarah and Master Sergeant huddled in the maintenance hangar, studying weather reports and flight manuals. The 4 trapped aircraft sat on the taxiway outside, buffeted by increasingly violent winds. "The window is closing fast," said, pointing to the latest weather update. "In 2 hours, the crosswinds will be too strong for any takeoff, even for an experienced pilot." Sarah nodded grimly. She had been running calculations in her head for the past hour. The auxiliary runway was 4,800 feet long, barely adequate for a stripped-down F-16 under ideal conditions. With the current winds and weather, it would require absolutely perfect timing and technique. "There's something else," continued. "I just got word from Colonel. He's ordered all remaining personnel to the storm shelters. Anyone still outside after 1400 hours will be considered AWOL." Sarah looked at her watch. It was already 12:45 hours. Even if she could somehow get permission to attempt the impossible, flying out the aircraft herself, there was no time for proper authorization through the chain of command. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to give me an honest answer." Nodded. "Based on everything you've seen me do, everything you know about my knowledge of these aircraft, do you think I could fly them out?" The master sergeant was quiet for a long moment. "Martinez, I've watched you work for 2 years. I've seen you troubleshoot problems that stumped veteran pilots. I've watched you study flight manuals like your life depended on it. And I've seen you in the simulators when you thought no one was looking." Sarah felt her heart racing. "That's not an answer." "Yes," said firmly. "I think you could fly them out. I think you're probably the only person left on this base who could do it under these conditions." The implications of what they were discussing hit both of them at the same time. Sarah would be violating direct orders, military regulations, and potentially risking her life. Would be helping her do it, which would end his 30-year career if they were caught. "But Martinez," continued, "even if you could fly them out successfully, you'd be facing a court-martial. Unauthorized operation of military aircraft is a serious offense. You could go to prison." Sarah walked to the hangar door and looked out at the 4 aircraft. The medical transport plane caught her eye. She knew it could carry 12 critically injured patients and had equipment that could keep people alive during transport to hospitals. In the aftermath of a Category 5 hurricane, that aircraft could be the difference between life and death for dozens of people. Her phone buzzed with another text from her brother Danny, who was still deployed overseas. "Thinking about you with that hurricane coming. Stay safe, sis." Danny's unit had been conducting medical evacuations in Afghanistan. He had told her stories about how a single aircraft could save entire villages, how the right equipment in the right place at the right time could prevent tragedies. Sarah thought about all the people along the Texas coast who were riding out the storm in shelters, trusting that help would be available when the hurricane passed. "Sergeant," she said, turning back to, "what would happen to those aircraft if they're destroyed in the storm?" "They'd be written off as total losses. The insurance investigation would take months. Replacement aircraft would take years to build." "And the medical transport?" His face darkened. "That's the only one of its kind in the region. Without it, post-storm medical evacuations would have to rely on helicopters and ground transport. In a Category 5 aftermath, that means some people won't get help in time." Sarah felt the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. She could follow orders, go to the shelter, and watch millions of dollars in equipment be destroyed while people died waiting for medical help that would never come. Or she could risk everything to save aircraft that could save lives. "There's one more thing you should know," said quietly. "I pulled your simulator records. Your flight scores are higher than most of the pilots on this base." Sarah stared at him. "You did what?" "I've been keeping track. Every time you've used the simulators during off-duty hours. Your reaction times, your decision-making under stress, your technical knowledge, Martinez. You're not just capable of being a pilot. You're capable of being an exceptional pilot." The hangar shook as another powerful gust of wind hit the building. Through the open door, they could see debris beginning to blow across the flight line. "We're running out of time," said. "If you're going to do this, it has to be now." Sarah closed her eyes and thought about everything that had led her to this moment. The rejection letters, the mockery from people like, the dreams of flying that she had carried since childhood. And now, finally, a chance to prove that 2 inches of height meant nothing compared to skill, knowledge, and determination. But more than that, she thought about the lives that hung in the balance. The people who would need those aircraft when the storm passed. The medical emergencies that the transport plane could handle. The search and rescue operations that the fighters could support. "Sergeant," she said, opening her eyes with newfound resolve, "I need you to help me get those aircraft ready for takeoff. Minimum fuel, essential systems only. And I need you to clear the auxiliary runway." Straightened up, his decision made. "Roger that, Martinez. Let's save some lives." As they began to move toward the trapped aircraft, neither of them noticed Staff Sergeant watching from across the hangar, his face twisted with anger and disbelief. By 1400 hours, the base was officially in lockdown. All personnel except essential emergency crews were supposed to be in the hardened storm shelters. The winds were now consistently over 70 miles per hour, with gusts reaching 90. Hurricane was just 2 hours from landfall. Sarah crouched beside the first F-16, shouting instructions to over the howling wind. They had been working frantically for the past hour, stripping unnecessary equipment from the aircraft and reducing fuel loads to the absolute minimum required for flight to the nearest inland base. "Fuel is at 2,000 pounds, called out. "That should be enough to reach, but there's no margin for error." Sarah nodded. She had calculated the fuel requirements dozens of times. With the reduced weight and favorable winds at altitude, she could make it to Austin Air Force Base with about 15 minutes of fuel to spare. It would be tight, but possible. The biggest challenge was the takeoff itself. The auxiliary runway was shorter than any of these aircraft were designed to use, especially in crosswind conditions. Sarah would need to achieve perfect rotation speed, an angle to get airborne before running out of runway. "Martinez," a voice shouted over the wind. Sarah turned to see Staff Sergeant approaching, flanked by 2 security police officers. Her heart sank as she realized that someone had reported their unauthorized activities. "Step away from the aircraft," commanded. "You're under orders to report to the storm shelter immediately." "Listen to me," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm. "These aircraft will be destroyed if we don't move them now. The medical transport alone could save dozens of lives after the storm." "That's not your decision to make," replied. You're not qualified to fly these aircraft and you're disobeying direct orders." Master Sergeant stepped forward. "Sergeant, I'm taking responsibility for this operation. Martinez is acting under my authority." "Your authority doesn't extend to unauthorized flight operations," one of the security police officers said. "Both of you need to come with us now." Sarah felt everything slipping away. The aircraft would be destroyed, lives would be lost, and her one chance to prove herself would disappear forever. She looked at the F-16, so close to being ready for flight, and made a desperate decision. "I'm sorry," she said too, then broke into a run toward the aircraft. "Stop!" shouted, but Sarah was already climbing the ladder to the cockpit. She had studied this procedure hundreds of times in simulators and manuals. Her hands moved automatically through the startup sequence as the security officers shouted at her from below. The engine began to spin up with a whine that quickly became a roar. Understood what she was doing and began waving the security officers back from the aircraft. "Clear the area. Jet blast danger." Sarah's radio crackled to life. "Unknown aircraft, this is tower control. You are not cleared for takeoff. Shut down immediately and exit the aircraft." Sarah keyed her radio. "Tower, this is Rescue 1. I'm attempting to save 4 aircraft from hurricane destruction. The medical transport is critical for post-storm operations." There was a pause, then a different voice came on the radio. "Rescue 1, this is Colonel Martinez. I know that's you. You need to shut down and exit the aircraft immediately. That's a direct order." Sarah hesitated for a moment. Colonel had always been fair to her, and she respected him greatly. But she thought about the people who would need medical evacuation after the hurricane, and she pressed forward with the engine startup. "Colonel, with respect, I can't do that. These aircraft are too valuable to lose, and I may be the only person who can save them." The engine was now at full power. Sarah began taxiing toward the auxiliary runway, fighting the crosswinds that tried to push the fighter jet off the taxiway. "Martinez," came Colonel's voice again, "even if you somehow manage to take off safely, you'll be facing court-martial. Your career will be over." "Sir," Sarah replied, approaching the runway threshold, "some things are more important than careers." She lined up on the auxiliary runway and ran through her final checks. The crosswinds were brutal, nearly 40 knots and gusting higher. The runway looked impossibly short ahead of her, disappearing into the storm-darkened landscape. Sarah thought about her brother Danny, fighting overseas to save lives. She thought about Master Sergeant, who had risked his career to help her. She thought about all the people along the Texas coast who were counting on help that might never come if these aircraft were destroyed. "Tower, Rescue 1 is rolling." Sarah pushed the throttles to full military power and released the brakes. The F-16 leaped forward, accelerating down the short runway as crosswinds buffeted the aircraft from side to side. Sarah fought to keep the fighter jet centered on the runway as her speed built toward rotation velocity. At 140 knots, she began to pull back on the stick. The aircraft lifted off with less than 500 feet of runway remaining, climbing into the violent storm at a steep angle. Sarah had done it, she was flying. But the hardest part was still ahead. She had 3 more aircraft to save, each takeoff more dangerous than the last as the storm continued to intensify. And waiting for her at the end was either vindication or disgrace, depending on whether anyone would understand why she had risked everything to do what she believed was right. As the F-16 climbed through the turbulent clouds toward clearer sky above, Sarah Martinez was about to discover that sometimes being 2 inches too short didn't matter nearly as much as having a heart big enough to risk everything for others. The flight to Austin Air Force Base was the most challenging hour of Sarah's life. Hurricane's outer bands created turbulence unlike anything described in flight manuals. The F-16 was tossed around like a toy, requiring constant corrections to maintain course and altitude. But Sarah held steady. Every hour she had spent studying these aircraft, every simulation she had run, every manual she had memorized paid off as she fought through the storm. When she finally touched down her fuel gauge showed exactly 12 minutes of flying time remaining. The ground crew that met her looked stunned as she climbed out of the cockpit. Word had already spread through military channels about the unauthorized flight from Randolph. "Ma'am," said the crew chief, "we've been ordered to refuel your aircraft immediately. Colonel is on the radio for you." Sarah took the radio with trembling hands. "Colonel, this is Martinez." "Martinez," came the colonel's voice, tight with stress and something else she couldn't identify. "I don't know whether to court-martial you or recommend you for a medal, but right now I need you to get back here. The storm has intensified beyond all predictions. We've got 3 more aircraft to save, and the window is closing fast." Sarah felt her heart racing. "Sir, you want me to go back?" "Martinez, I've been in contact with weather services and flight operations at 3 different bases. Every pilot I've consulted says what you just did was impossible, but you did it. And right now, you may be the only person who can save those remaining aircraft." The return flight was even more harrowing. Sarah had to navigate around the edge of the hurricane's eye wall, where winds exceeded 180 miles per hour. But she made it back to Randolph just as the storm's full fury began to hit the Texas coast. The scene that greeted her was chaos. Master Sergeant and a skeleton crew were still on the flight line, having refused orders to take shelter. The 3 remaining aircraft, 2 F-16s and the critical medical transport, were being battered by winds that were now consistently over 100 miles per hour. "Martinez," shouted over the storm as she climbed out of a transport helicopter that had brought her back from. "You've got maybe 30 minutes before conditions become impossible for takeoff." Staff Sergeant was nowhere to be seen. He had been ordered to the shelter, along with the security police who had tried to stop the operation. Colonel had made the decision to let Sarah continue, understanding that court-martial proceedings could wait until after the hurricane passed. The second F-16 takeoff went smoothly despite deteriorating conditions. Sarah was growing more confident with each flight, her skills adapting to the extreme weather conditions. But the third aircraft, another F-16, presented new challenges. As Sarah taxied toward the auxiliary runway, a massive gust of wind caught the aircraft and nearly pushed it off the taxiway. She fought for control, her heart pounding as she realized how close she had come to disaster. "Rescue 1 abort takeoff," came Colonel's voice over the radio. "Conditions are too dangerous." Sarah looked ahead at the runway, barely visible through the driving rain and debris. The winds were now gusting to over 120 miles per hour. Any reasonable person would abort the mission. But Sarah thought about the medical transport aircraft still waiting on the ground. That aircraft represented the difference between life and death for hurricane victims who would need emergency evacuation. She couldn't quit now, not when lives hung in the balance. "Negative tower, Rescue 1 is committed." The takeoff was terrifying. Crosswinds tried to flip the F-16 onto its side as Sarah fought to maintain control. Debris from the storm struck the aircraft multiple times. At one point, she wasn't sure if she was flying or being blown through the air by the hurricane winds. But somehow, she made it airborne and fought her way through the storm to safety. The final aircraft, the medical transport, was the most critical and the most difficult. It was larger and less maneuverable than the fighters, making it more vulnerable to crosswinds. Worse, the storm had intensified even further during Sarah's absence. As she approached the auxiliary runway for the 4th and final time, Sarah could see that conditions had deteriorated beyond anything she had previously encountered. Debris was flying through the air, visibility was near zero, and the crosswinds were now sustained at over 130 miles per hour. "Martinez," came Colonel's voice, urgent and concerned, "I'm ordering you to abort. It's too dangerous." Sarah looked at the medical transport, knowing it could save dozens of lives in the hurricane's aftermath. She thought about her brother Danny and all the soldiers who risked their lives to save others. She thought about the oath she had taken when she joined the Air Force, to support and defend, to serve something greater than herself. "Sir, with respect, I'm going to complete the mission." The takeoff of the medical transport was beyond description. The aircraft was barely controllable in the hurricane-force winds. Sarah had to use every skill she possessed, and several she didn't know she had to get the larger aircraft airborne. At one point, the transport was actually flying sideways, crabbing into the wind at a 30-degree angle just to maintain forward progress. But she made it. 4 aircraft saved, millions of dollars in equipment preserved. Most importantly, a medical transport that would prove crucial in the days following hurricane. When Sarah finally returned to base 3 days after the hurricane passed, she found a very different reception waiting for her. Hurricane had been the most destructive storm in Texas history, causing billions in damage and requiring massive rescue and recovery operations. The medical transport aircraft she had saved had already conducted 17 evacuation flights, carrying 127 critically injured people to hospitals. The fighter aircraft had been used for reconnaissance and search operations, locating survivors in areas that ground teams couldn't reach. Colonel met her as she climbed out of the transport helicopter that had brought her back from her final mission. "Martinez," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of amazement and respect, "we need to talk." Sarah braced herself for the court-martial proceedings she knew were coming. She had violated direct orders, operated aircraft without proper authorization, and risked millions of dollars in military equipment. By any measure, she should be facing serious consequences. "Sir, I understand that my actions were." Colonel held up his hand. "Martinez, do you know how many lives those aircraft have saved in the past 3 days?" Sarah shook her head. 147 confirmed rescues. The medical transport alone has evacuated patients who would have died without immediate hospital care. The reconnaissance flights guided ground teams to survivors trapped in areas we never would have found otherwise. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. "More than that," the colonel continued, "I've received calls from 3 different generals, the Secretary of the Air Force, and 2 senators asking about the pilot who saved those aircraft. It seems word has spread about what you accomplished." Behind Colonel, Sarah could see a crowd gathering. Master Sergeant was there, beaming with pride. Captain had returned from her evacuation flight and was watching with obvious admiration. Even some of the pilots who had initially doubted Sarah were nodding with respect. Notably absent was Staff Sergeant. "Martinez," said Colonel, "I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross for your actions during hurricane. More than that, I'm personally endorsing your application for immediate entry into pilot training." Sarah's legs nearly gave out. "Sir, the height requirements have been waived by special authorization from Air Force Headquarters. It seems that someone finally realized that exceptional circumstances require exceptional flexibility in regulations." The crowd began to applaud, but Colonel wasn't finished. "There's something else, Martinez. The Air Force is establishing a new program for combat-tested aviators who demonstrate exceptional skill under extreme conditions. You've been selected as the first candidate." Sarah could hardly believe what she was hearing. Everything she had dreamed of, everything she had worked toward, was finally within reach. Master Sergeant stepped forward. "Martinez, there's one more thing you should know. Staff Sergeant requested a transfer to another base. Seems he couldn't handle working with a pilot who's better than most of the people he used to mock." As the crowd began to disperse, Captain approached Sarah. "You know, I always said you could fly, but what you did during that hurricane, that wasn't just flying. That was something else entirely." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. You didn't just save aircraft, Martinez. You proved that courage and skill matter more than outdated regulations. You opened doors that had been closed to people like us for decades. That evening, Sarah drove her old pickup truck back to the wheat fields outside Cedar Falls, just as she had done as a child. But this time, she wasn't dreaming about flying. She was a pilot, officially and finally. Her phone buzzed with a message from Danny, who had heard about her heroic actions through military channels. Saw the news about Hurricane, my sister, the hero pilot. I always knew you'd make it, sis. You just had to find the right storm to prove it. Sarah smiled and looked up at the clear sky, where stars were beginning to appear. Tomorrow, she would report for advanced pilot training. She would fly fighters and transports, conduct rescue missions and training flights. She would do everything she had dreamed of since she was 7 years old. But tonight, she simply sat in the bed of her pickup truck and watched the sky, knowing that sometimes the biggest obstacles in life aren't the ones other people put in your way. Sometimes they're the ones you put in your own way by accepting limitations that were never really there to begin with. 2 inches had kept Sarah Martinez from her dreams for years, but in the end, it wasn't her height that defined her as a pilot. It was her heart, her skill, and her willingness to risk everything to save others. And that, Sarah realized, was something that could never be measured in inches. 6 months later, Lieutenant Sarah Martinez graduated first in her pilot training class. She went on to become one of the Air Force's most decorated rescue pilots, saving hundreds of lives during natural disasters and combat operations around the world. The height requirement for Air Force pilots was officially changed the following year, opening opportunities for thousands of qualified candidates who had previously been excluded. Sarah's actions during Hurricane became a case study in military academies, teaching future officers that sometimes the most important qualifications can't be found in a regulation manual. But Sarah's favorite moment came 2 years later, when she received a letter from a young girl in Cedar Falls, Texas. The girl was only 5 feet tall and dreamed of becoming a pilot. She had heard Sarah's story and wanted to know if it was really possible for someone like her to fly. Sarah wrote back immediately, "Dream big, work hard, and never let anyone tell you that you're too small to do something great. Sometimes the biggest heroes come in the smallest packages." And in her heart, Sarah knew it was true. After all, she was living proof that 2 inches meant nothing compared to the size of someone's dreams.